That's not what I said, I whispered, staring at my husband's phone while my own voice played back at me like a stranger's. The message was sharp, cold, almost cruel. It sounded like me, and yet every word felt wrong, as if someone had taken my voice and dressed it in anger I never gave it. Ethan stood across our kitchen island, one hand braced against the granite, his face tight with exhaustion and disappointment. The late afternoon sun spilled through the windows over the sink, catching the dust in the air and making everything look almost peaceful, which somehow made it worse. "Claire, I heard it myself," he said quietly. "You called me on my lunch break and left that voicemail. You said my mother was manipulative, needy, and that I needed to stop letting her run our marriage." He paused, swallowing hard. "You also said you were done being polite." My chest tightened so fast I had to grip the edge of the counter. I had called him on his lunch break. That part was true. I remembered standing in the Target parking lot with a paper bag in one hand and my phone in the other, leaving him a quick message because he hadn't picked up. I'd told him I was grabbing cold medicine, that traffic on Route 9 was awful, and that his mom had called twice asking if I'd remembered her pharmacy pickup. I had ended the message the way I always did. "Love you. Drive safe." But that wasn't what he had just played. Not even close. Margaret sat at the breakfast nook, both hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea as if she were nothing more than a worried mother caught in the middle. Her silver blonde hair was set perfectly, not a strand out of place, and her expression was carefully arranged into that soft concern she wore so well. "Ethan, sweetheart, maybe this isn't the time," she said in that low, gentle voice of hers. "Claire's been under a lot of stress lately." I turned to look at her, and something cold moved through me. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something that felt like a door unlocking in the dark. Because Margaret had that look on her face again. That tiny crease between her brows. That slight downward tilt of her mouth. The same expression she wore every time Ethan and I argued over something I could never quite explain. The same expression she wore when she stepped in to comfort him before I'd even had the chance to defend myself. "Play it again," I said. Ethan blinked. "Claire, please." He hesitated, then tapped the screen. My voice filled the kitchen again, clipped and brittle and wrong. I listened harder this time. To the pauses, to the rhythm, to the shape of the words. And then I heard it. One phrase. Just 3 words. A phrase I had never used in my life, but one Margaret used constantly. "At your age." Ethan looked at me like he was waiting for tears, or maybe another fight. Instead, I straightened slowly and set my keys on the counter with deliberate care. My pulse was pounding, but my voice came out calm. "I did call you," I said, "but that is not the message I left." Margaret let out the faintest breath, almost too soft to hear. Ethan stared at me, confused, skeptical, wounded. I met his eyes and felt something inside me shift from hurt into certainty. For months, I had thought my marriage was slipping through my fingers. Standing there in that bright, spotless kitchen, listening to a version of myself I didn't recognize, I realized something far worse. My husband hadn't stopped hearing me. Someone had been making sure he never heard me at all. That night, I did not sleep. Ethan fell asleep sometime after midnight, turned away from me on his side of the bed, one arm tucked under his pillow the way he had done since college. Usually, I found that familiar, comforting even. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning in slow, steady circles above us, all I could think about was the sound of my own voice coming from his phone, twisted into something sharp and unrecognizable. The bedroom was cool and quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional headlights sliding across the wall from cars passing on the street below. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, I felt like there was a stranger sleeping beside me, not because Ethan had changed overnight, but because I was beginning to understand that someone had been changing what he believed about me piece by piece. By 7 the next morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee while the house still held that fragile silence that only exists before a day fully begins. Margaret was already awake. Of course she was. She was standing at the stove in her pale blue robe, stirring oatmeal in one of my saucepans as if she had lived there her whole life. She glanced over her shoulder and gave me a sympathetic smile. "I thought Ethan might want something easy on his stomach," she said. "He barely touched dinner." I set my mug down carefully on the counter. "That was thoughtful." The words came out polite. "Automatic." She nodded, as if we were 2 women navigating a difficult season together, and not one woman I suddenly suspected of quietly setting my life on fire from the inside. 6 months earlier, I would have believed every bit of it. 6 months earlier, when Ethan had his minor back surgery and Margaret insisted on staying with us just for a few days, I had actually been grateful. We had been married just under 3 years, living in a white colonial outside Hartford with a maple tree in the front yard and a kitchen. I had spent 2 weekends painting myself because the old owners thought mustard yellow was a reasonable choice. Our life was not glamorous, but it was ours. Ethan worked long hours as a project manager for a commercial construction firm, and I handled client services for a dental office in town. We were busy, tired, ordinary. The kind of ordinary I had always wanted. Then his recovery took longer than expected. Not dramatic, just enough that he moved slower, slept badly, and let his mother take over things I would normally have handled. She organized his medications. She answered the door. She started taking his phone upstairs when he forgot it on the charger. She laughed it off whenever I noticed. "You two are hopeless without me," she would say. At first, it felt harmless. Helpful even. But over the next few weeks, something subtle shifted. Ethan started asking me strange questions. Why had I sounded irritated in messages I thought were perfectly normal? Why was I so short with him during work hours? Why did I keep bringing up his mother in that tone? The first time it happened, I assumed he had misheard me. The second time, I wondered if he was just stressed. By the third or fourth time, I started checking myself, replaying conversations in my head during my commute, standing in the shower trying to remember whether I had sounded colder than I meant to. Margaret was always there afterward, calm and understanding, pressing a hand to his shoulder, telling him everyone was under pressure and marriage could be hard in the early years. She never accused me directly. She never had to. She just stood close enough to the fracture line to make sure it widened. Standing in my own kitchen the morning after that voicemail, watching her sprinkle cinnamon over Ethan's breakfast like a saint in a catalog ad, I realized the most dangerous part was not what she had done. It was how carefully she had made it all look like my fault. By Friday afternoon, I stopped trying to defend myself and started paying attention instead. That was new for me. I had spent months doing what most wives do when something feels off, but still seems explainable. I softened my tone. I chose my words more carefully. I reread texts before sending them. I left cheerful voicemails during lunch breaks and warm ones before I drove home from the office, hoping that if I was consistent enough, kind enough, unmistakable enough, whatever strange static had settled over our marriage would finally clear. It never did. If anything, the more careful I became, the more distorted everything seemed when it came back to me through Ethan. That Friday, I left work a little early and sat in my car outside the dental office with the engine off, watching rain collect on the windshield in slow silver trails. I scrolled through my call history for the last 2 weeks. 3 missed calls to Ethan. 4 voicemails left. 2 of those had led to arguments. One had somehow become a full-blown lecture about respecting boundaries after I had simply asked whether he wanted tomato soup or chicken noodle for dinner. I remember that call clearly because I had been standing in the soup aisle at Stop and Shop, holding both cans in my hands like the answer mattered more than it did. By the time I got home, Margaret was in the living room folding Ethan's laundry. Not ours. His. His t-shirts, his gym shorts, his undershirts, all stacked in neat little piles on the coffee table while a game show played softly on television. "You should not have done that," I said, setting my purse down. She smiled without looking up. "I know where he likes everything." It was such a small sentence. So ordinary. But it landed with that same faint wrongness I had been noticing more and more lately. Margaret always said things that sounded harmless until you sat with them for a minute. "I know where he likes everything." Not you. Me. Later that evening, Ethan came downstairs after his shower, rubbing a towel through his hair, and asked me why I had called him dramatic in a voicemail about soup. I actually laughed at first because I thought he was joking. Then I saw his face. "I never said that," I told him. "Claire, I heard it," he said, tired already, like he was bracing for a familiar disappointment. Margaret looked up from the sofa, then quickly looked back down at the sweater she was folding. "Maybe she was just frustrated," she murmured. "It has been a long week for everyone." There it was again. She always arrived in the conversation half a second before I did, as if she had been waiting just outside the door of every misunderstanding, ready to step in with tea, sympathy, and a version of me that sounded harder than the real one. I did not argue that night. I watched. I watched Ethan hand his phone to his mother when he went upstairs to grab his charger. I watched her thumb hover over the screen a second too long before she set it down beside her. I watched the way she tilted her head when he repeated something I had supposedly said, not surprised, not confused, but almost satisfied. And then something small, something almost ridiculous, snapped everything into sharper focus. Ethan repeated a phrase from one of my messages, one I supposedly used when I was upset with him. At your age, you should know better. I stared at him. I had never said that to my husband in my life. But Margaret had. I had heard her say it to him 3 times in the last month alone, always in that same disappointed tone she reserved for gentle humiliation. I smiled then, not because anything was funny, but because for the first time, the fog was thinning. I still did not know exactly how she was doing it, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My mother-in-law was not just standing near our problems. She was speaking through them. The next morning, I tested the theory without telling anyone. I left the house at 8:15 with my usual canvas tote, kissed Ethan on the cheek while he stood at the sink finishing his coffee, and told him I had an early inventory meeting at the office. That part was true. What I did not tell him was that I sat in my car 2 blocks away in the church parking lot for nearly 20 minutes with my phone in my hand, staring at his contact name on the screen like it might blink first. My heart was beating hard enough to make my fingertips cold, which annoyed me more than anything. I did not want to feel scared. I wanted to feel certain. So I took a slow breath and called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Perfect. I kept my tone warm, almost deliberately cheerful. Hey, sweetheart. I forgot to ask if you wanted me to swing by Russo's after work and pick up that lemon cake you like from the bakery counter. If not, I can just make pasta tonight. Love you. That was it. No mention of Margaret. No complaint. No room for interpretation. Just lemon cake and pasta. Then I waited. By lunchtime, Ethan had not texted back. By 2:30, I had nearly convinced myself I was wrong, that I was spiraling, that grief and stress and too many small humiliations had finally made me suspicious of shadows. Then my phone buzzed while I was refilling patient folders behind the front desk. Ethan. I stepped into the supply room before answering. What is going on with you? He asked without preamble, his voice low and tense. I stared at the shelves of gauze and fluoride rinse, the smell of mint and disinfectant suddenly too sharp in the small room. What are you talking about? I asked. My mother said you called and left some nasty little message about how if she wanted dessert so badly, she could buy her own cake, and that maybe she should stop treating our house like a bed and breakfast. My grip tightened around the phone so fast my knuckles ached. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not subtle. This time. Not a misunderstanding. Not stress. A clean, impossible contradiction. Ethan, I said carefully. I asked if you wanted lemon cake from Russo's. That is all I said. Silence. Then the familiar exhale, the one he used when he thought I was about to make his life harder. Claire, I do not know why you keep doing this. I heard the message. No, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. You heard a message. That is not the same thing. He did not respond for 2 full seconds. Then he muttered that he had to get back to a meeting and hung up. I stood there in that tiny supply room with my pulse thudding in my throat, and instead of crying, I smiled. Because now I had what I needed. Not proof yet, but pattern. A clean test with a clean result. That evening, I got home before either of them. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher running and the old grandfather clock in the hall ticking like it had all the time in the world. I set my bag down, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and pulled up the family cloud account Ethan and I had shared since our honeymoon. Mostly for photos. Backups. Device syncing. The kind of boring digital housekeeping no one thinks about until they need it. I clicked through folders I had not touched in months. Photos. Notes. Contacts. Audio. My breath caught. There was a voicemail archive folder I did not remember creating, automatically synced from our carrier backup. I opened it and found dozens of files with timestamps, dates, and duplicate versions. Some marked original. Some marked downloaded. Some marked modified. I stared at the screen until the room seemed to tilt around me. Then I saw something even colder. A linked device I did not recognize by name at first, until I read the model number and remembered exactly where I had seen it before. Margaret's old silver iPad. The one she claimed she only used for crossword puzzles. I did not hear the front door when they came in. I was too busy staring at the screen, one hand over my mouth, the other gripping the edge of the kitchen table hard enough to leave marks in my palm. The files were all there in neat rows, organized by date and time, like a polite little archive of my marriage unraveling. I clicked one from 2 weeks earlier, the one that had started an argument over nothing on a Tuesday night. First, I opened the file labeled original. My own voice came through the laptop speakers, tired but soft. "Hey, love, I know you were slammed today. I just wanted to remind you that your mom's prescription is ready at Walgreens, and I can pick it up on my way home. Call me if you need anything." Then I opened the modified version. I actually stopped breathing for a second. The same voice. My voice. But the middle had been cut, tightened, rearranged. "Your mom is ready. I can pick it up if you need anything." It sounded clipped, irritated, passive-aggressive in a way that would have been easy to hear badly if you were already being told I was resentful. I clicked another. And another. A message about traffic had become a complaint about being treated like a chauffeur. A reminder about dinner had become a sarcastic jab about his mother eating us out of house and home. The edits were not flashy. That was the genius of it. Whoever did this understood that the most believable lies are only a few inches away from the truth. My stomach turned, but my mind had never felt clearer. I opened the metadata panel on one of the files. Original creation time. Sync time. Downloaded to linked device. Modified version uploaded. The device ID matched the same old silver iPad. Margaret's. I was still sitting there when Ethan walked into the kitchen with Margaret right behind him, carrying a shopping bag from the local pharmacy like she had just returned from some sweet little errand. He stopped when he saw my laptop open. "What are you doing?" he asked. I looked up at him and closed the metadata window before he could see it. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I was suddenly certain I could not show him yet. Not like this. Not without making sure it was airtight. Margaret set the pharmacy bag on the counter and smiled at me in that maddeningly gentle way. "Everything all right, Claire?" she asked. I met her eyes and smiled right back. Just catching up on some old files. If she felt anything, she did not show it. She moved past me, reached for a mug, and asked Ethan whether he wanted tea before dinner. He said yes. Of course he did. I watched the two of them move around my kitchen with that awful, practiced familiarity and realized something important. If I confronted her now, she would deny everything. She would call it a glitch, a sinking issue, a misunderstanding. Ethan, still standing on the shaky bridge between doubt and loyalty, would want an explanation simple enough to survive. I needed more than proof. I needed a moment he could not rationalize away. That night, after both of them had gone upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table again under the dim pendant light and made a copy of every file onto an external drive. Then I took screenshots of the timestamps, the device logs, the linked account details, and the modification history. I emailed them to a brand new account Margaret did not know existed. After that, I did one more thing. I left Ethan a voicemail. Calm, sweet, deliberately ordinary. I told him I was thinking about stopping by my sister Nora's place on Sunday to ask about the antique bracelet our grandmother left me, the one worth nearly $8,000, because I was considering having it appraised. The bracelet did not exist. Neither did the inheritance story, but the bait did. And as I ended the call, I looked up toward the dark second floor where Margaret was sleeping under my roof and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Go ahead. Do it one more time." Sunday arrived gray and cold, the kind of Connecticut morning that made the windows look like frosted glass even after the heat kicked on. I was in the kitchen before 8, making coffee and slicing strawberries into a ceramic bowl while the house still carried that quiet, suspended feeling right before people start pretending to be normal. I had barely set the bowl on the table when Margaret appeared in the doorway wearing a cream sweater and pearl studs, already dressed as if she had somewhere important to be. "You are up early," she said lightly. "I barely slept," I replied, keeping my eyes on the knife in my hand. "I am heading to Nora's later. I want to ask her about grandmother Evelyn's bracelet before I decide what to do with it." I said it casually, exactly the way I had planned, as if it were nothing more than family housekeeping. Margaret's expression did not change much, but I saw it. That tiny flash. Interest first, then calculation. "Oh," she asked, reaching for a mug. "I did not realize you had anything of Evelyn's left." I shrugged. "Not much. Just the bracelet. Nora thinks it might be worth something now." Then I changed the subject and asked if she wanted sourdough toast. By noon, The trap had sprung. Ethan came downstairs from his home office with a crease between his brows and that unsettled look I had come to know too well. "Why are you suddenly talking about selling family heirlooms without discussing it with me?" he asked. I was at the sink rinsing coffee cups. I turned off the water slowly and looked at him. "What are you talking about?" He crossed his arms. "My mother said she heard a voicemail where you were talking about pawning some bracelet and keeping the money in a separate account in case things between us got worse." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "She said it sounded like you were planning an exit." There it was. Bigger this time. Cleaner. Greed, secrecy, marriage trouble, all wrapped into one ugly little package designed to make me look disloyal and unstable. I looked past him to the staircase. Margaret was standing halfway down, one hand on the banister, perfectly still. Listening. Watching. Waiting to see whether I would panic. Instead, I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked to the kitchen table where my laptop already sat closed, plugged in, ready. "Sit down," I said. Ethan frowned. "Claire, I am not trying to fight." "I know," I said. "That is why I need you to sit down." Something in my voice must have reached him, because after a second, he pulled out a chair. Margaret descended the rest of the stairs in careful silence. "Is everything all right?" she asked, all concern and composure. I looked directly at her. "Actually, yes. I think it finally is." I opened the laptop. My fingers were steady now, steadier than they had been in months. First, I pulled up the voicemail I had left the night before. The original. My voice filled the kitchen, calm and ordinary. I mentioned Nora. I mentioned asking about the bracelet. Nothing about selling it. Nothing about money. Nothing about separate accounts. Then I clicked the second file. The modified version. My own voice again, but cut and stitched into something colder. "Nora, bracelet, worth something, decide what to do, separate account, if things get worse." Ethan leaned forward so sharply his chair scraped against the hardwood. "What is this?" he whispered. I did not answer right away. I opened the metadata pane instead. 2 files. Same source. One original. One altered. Timestamps. Upload history. Access logs. And then, in the right-hand column, the linked device information. The silver iPad. Margaret's old iPad. The one connected through our shared family cloud. I rotated the screen toward him. "This," I said softly, "is what you have been hearing for months." Ethan did not speak for what felt like a full minute. He just stared at the screen, his face draining of color as the evidence sat there between us in plain, boring digital language. Timestamps. File versions. Device logs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just facts. Margaret, on the other hand, recovered faster than I expected. She took 2 careful steps toward the table and let out a small breath that might have sounded shocked to someone who did not know her as well as I now did. "This has to be some kind of syncing error," she said, one hand lightly touching her chest. "Claire, honey, I do not even know how to edit audio files." Honey. She had not called me that in months. Not since before I became a problem she needed Ethan to manage. I looked at her and almost admired the performance. Almost. "That is interesting," I said quietly, clicking open another folder. "Because the modified files were not just opened on your device. They were exported from it." Ethan looked up sharply. "Mom." She turned to him at once, her eyes wide and wounded, already reaching for the role she knew best. "Ethan, sweetheart, you know I would never do something like that. I only ever listened because I was worried. Sometimes your phone would be left downstairs, and I thought if Claire was upset, maybe I could help smooth things over before you got stressed." There it was. Not denial. Not really. Just a softer confession hidden inside a justification. I saw the exact second Ethan heard it too. His expression changed in a way I had not seen before. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. "You listened to my voicemails?" he asked. Margaret blinked, as if the question itself were unfair. "Only a few. By accident at first. Then only because you have been under so much pressure, and I could tell Claire was getting more and more." She trailed off, as if she were too gracious to finish the sentence. "I did it for her." "Difficult?" I asked. "Unstable? Ungrateful?" She looked at me then, and for the first time, the sweetness slipped. Just for a heartbeat. But I saw it. A flash of irritation. Of being cornered. "I think you have been overwhelmed," she said carefully. "And I think Ethan needed someone level-headed in the house." Ethan pushed his chair back, so hard it nearly tipped. "In the house?" he repeated. This is our house. Margaret opened her mouth, but he cut her off. You went through my phone? His voice was rising now, not loud enough to be frightening, just raw enough to sound like something finally tearing open. You listened to Claire's messages before I did? You changed them. I did not change anything, she snapped, too quickly, then caught herself and lowered her tone. I may have clipped one or two because you did not need all the extra emotional commentary, but only because she has a way of making everything sound worse than it is. Silence. Absolute silence. It landed so cleanly that even she seemed to realize what she had just admitted. I did not say a word. I did not need to. Ethan slowly turned to look at me, and the shame in his face was almost harder to witness than the betrayal. For months, he had doubted me, corrected me, looked at me like I was the problem. And now the truth was sitting right there in the middle of our kitchen like a third witness neither of us could ignore. Margaret took a step toward him. Sweetheart, please, you do not understand. I was protecting you. She was turning you against your family. Ethan stepped back, actually stepped back from his own mother. No, he said, his voice flat now. You were turning me against my wife. Margaret's eyes flicked to me, sharp and bright, as if she still believed there was a version of this where she could somehow make me look guilty. But I was done explaining. I reached over, unplugged the laptop, and slid the external drive into my pocket. I already backed up everything, I said. Every file, every version, every timestamp, including the one from last night. Then I looked at Ethan, not with anger, but with a calm I had earned the hard way. Now you know why your marriage has felt like someone else has been living inside it. Margaret left the kitchen first, but she did not storm out. That would have been too honest. She moved with stiff, offended dignity, one hand brushing the banister as she went upstairs like a woman withdrawing from an unfair accusation rather than a woman caught rearranging other people's lives with audio files and careful timing. The guest room door closed a few seconds later. Not slammed, just shut with enough force to make the hallway clock tremble. Ethan and I stayed where we were, standing on opposite sides of the kitchen table while the dishwasher hummed in the background and the strawberries I had sliced that morning sat untouched in their bowl, bright and pointless. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, both hands clasped together like he was trying to hold something in place inside himself. How long? He asked finally, staring at the floorboards. His voice sounded thinner than usual. I did not pretend not to understand. At least 6 months, I said. Probably longer. He closed his eyes. I watched the answer hit him in layers. 6 months of tension. 6 months of second-guessing. 6 months of looking at me like I was harder to love than I used to be. Why did you not tell me sooner? He asked. That one hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was human. Because some part of him still wanted this to be a misunderstanding we had both contributed to, instead of what it really was. I tried, I said. I just did not have language for something this insane until I found the files. He looked up then, and the shame in his face was raw enough that I had to look away for a second. I thought you were changing, he said quietly. I thought maybe you were getting resentful and just hiding it until I was not around. I nodded. Once. I know. He swallowed hard. I kept hearing things in your voice that did not match your face. That sentence sat between us heavier than anything else. Because that was exactly what had been stolen. Not just trust. Recognition. The simple comfort of being known by the person you married. Upstairs, we could hear a drawer open and close in the guest room. Then another. Margaret was packing, or pretending to. With her, both were possible. Ethan stood abruptly and looked toward the ceiling, jaw tight. She cannot stay here tonight. I studied him for a second before answering. That is your decision. He let out a humorless laugh. No, it should have been my decision months ago. I just did not know I was being managed. He headed for the stairs, but I reached out and caught his wrist before he took the first step. He stopped and looked back at me. Do not go up there angry, I said. Go up there clear. He stared at me for a second, then nodded. When he came back down 20 minutes later, he looked 10 years older. She is calling my aunt in New Haven, he said. She says she only wanted to protect me from making a mistake. I folded my arms and leaned against the counter. Meaning me. He winced. Yes. Another silence settled in. Different this time. Not hostile. Just honest. Ethan moved to the kitchen table and sat again, this time closer to where I stood. I do not know how to fix this, he said. I do not mean with her. I mean with us. I looked at him for a long time before answering. You do not fix 6 months in one afternoon. He nodded slowly. Then tell me where to start. Outside, a light snow had started falling, soft and steady against the backyard fence. Inside, the house felt strange, as if the walls were finally hearing the truth after months of carrying around someone else's version of me. I looked at the man I married, at the exhaustion in his face, at the guilt, at the quiet fear that maybe he had let something precious be damaged beyond repair. Then I gave him the only honest answer I had. First, I said, you take her access off every account we own, every phone, every backup, every password. Then tomorrow, we call a therapist. And after that, you learn the difference between your mother needing you and your mother controlling you. He nodded once, like each sentence was landing exactly where it belonged. Upstairs, I heard the guest room door open again. Margaret was coming down. This time, she would not be carrying tea. Margaret came down the stairs with one rolling suitcase and her handbag hooked over her arm. Dressed in that same careful dignity she used like armor whenever the world refused to go along with her version of events. Her lipstick had been reapplied. Her hair had been brushed. If a neighbor had walked in at that exact moment, they might have thought she was the one leaving after being mistreated. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Ethan first, not me. That was deliberate. It had always been deliberate. I hope you know what you are doing, she said, her voice low and trembling in just the right places. One day, when she hurts you the way I was trying to prevent, do not say, I did not warn you. Ethan did not move. He stood near the kitchen table with both hands flat against the wood, looking at his mother with a kind of exhausted clarity that made him seem older and, for the first time in months, fully himself. You do not get to warn me about damage you caused, he said. And you do not get to talk about my wife like she is the thread in this house. Margaret's chin lifted. I am still your mother. Yes, he said. And that is the only reason I am making this simple. She looked at him, waiting, maybe still hoping there was one last emotional lever she had not pulled hard enough. When he did not bend, her gaze slid to me. There was no softness left in it now. No performance. Just the cold irritation of someone whose favorite game had ended in public. You think you have won something, she said. I leaned against the counter, calm enough now that even my own voice surprised me. No, I said. I think I finally heard the truth clearly. That landed harder than shouting would have. I could see it in the way her mouth tightened. For months, she had borrowed my voice to poison my marriage. She had counted on me, sounding emotional, reactive, impossible. What she never seemed to understand was that calm can be louder than cruelty when it is backed by facts. Ethan walked her to the front door, but he did not carry her suitcase. He did not reach for her coat. He opened the door, and the cold afternoon air swept into the foyer along with a swirl of light snow. Margaret stood there for one last second, framed by the doorway, as if she expected the house itself to protest her exit. It did not. She stepped outside. Ethan closed the door gently behind her. No slam. No scene. Just a clean ending to something that had been rotting for far too long. The silence after she left felt enormous. Not empty, just unfamiliar. Like a room after a clock has finally stopped ticking and you realize how loud it had been all along. Ethan stood with his hand still resting on the doorknob for a moment before turning back toward me. I deleted her access from everything, he said. Phones, cloud backups, shared passwords. I even called the carrier and removed every linked device. I nodded. Good. He came back into the kitchen slowly, like a man approaching something fragile that he had once taken for granted. I know that is not enough, he said. I know none of this disappears just because she is gone. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in that. The house was quieter now, but the damage had not vanished with the suitcase. It was still in the pauses between us, in the months we had lost, in the way I had learned to measure every word, wondering how it would come back distorted. No, I said softly. It does not disappear. He nodded once, eyes shining in that way men often try very hard to hide. Then I will do the long part, he said. The uncomfortable part. The part that takes time. I believed him. Not because love magically fixes betrayal, and not because one good afternoon erases 6 bad months, but because for the first time in a long time, he was choosing clarity over comfort. Later that night, after the therapist appointment was scheduled and every account had been changed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened the cloud archive one last Time. I listened to one of the original messages. Just a simple one. My voice, warm and ordinary. Real. Then I closed the laptop and slid the external drive into the back of the junk drawer beside old takeout menus and spare batteries. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. She had spent months stealing my voice and using it like a weapon. In the end, the one thing that destroyed her was the one thing she never thought to fear. A backup copy of the truth.